Опа. Опа, блин.
Of defense and military leaders on Tuesday in Ramstein here in Germany.
The US airbase in Ramstein, Germany. This is where the United States and its allies pledged new packages of ever heavier weapons for Ukraine during a meeting on Tuesday that was hosted by US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin.
We don't have any time to waste. The briefings today laid out clearly why the coming weeks will be so crucial for Ukraine. So we've got to move at the speed of war. And I know that all the leaders leave today more resolved than ever to support Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression.
The day kicked off with a surprise. In a notable policy shift, Germany, which had been criticized for refusing to send heavy weapons to Ukraine, announced it would now send Gepard anti-aircraft systems. We've made the decision that it's now important to support anti-aircraft defense. That can be done with a Gepard, and it's exactly what's on the list of what Ukraine needs. And that is what we, coordinated with others, are now making possible. We'll continue doing this. Not everyone in Berlin welcomed the decision. I find it problematic. Germany doesn't even have enough military equipment for itself in the case of Putin totally losing control.
I think it's important
I also think that what the German government is doing is good, but I am also not sure if offering weapons is actually going to stop the war.
I don't like how hesitant they've been. Ultimately, I would actually be for aggressive weapons, heavier machinery.
In his closing remarks, Austin said the gathering between the US and its allies will not be the last. Once a month, they'll meet to discuss Ukraine's defense needs to help them fight the Russian invasion.
Now let's bring in Ralf Stegner. He's a member of the German Parliament for Chancellor Olaf Scholz governing Social Democrats. Mr. Stegner, finally, after weeks of reluctance, internal coalition dispute and unusually sharp criticism from its allies and from Ukraine, Germany is now delivering a few heavy weapons to Ukraine. What prompted this U-turn by Olaf Scholz now?
Well, I don't think that the impression is correct. We always said that we try to support Ukraine with everything we can, which is responsible in terms of political, economic, financial, and military aid, and we do that in very close consulting process with our allies. And so we did this way. We are talking about defense tanks, and that was decided because the Ukrainians needed to defend themselves, anti-aircraft tanks, not offensive ones, and therefore I don't see a policy shift. And besides, the second part we really have to look at is that we have the Ukrainians as best as we can, but not enhancing the risk of getting NATO or Germany being involved in the war itself.
Well, nobody else seems to be worried that NATO gets involved in the war with if NATO members help Ukraine with weapons, and also Germany continues to import Russian gas, financing Putin's war. Isn't that inconsistent?
Well, first of all, I don't think you're right with your assumption, because I understand that President Biden and President Macron argue exactly the same way as Olaf Scholz does, and we're in very close talks about that, and that we need to get out of energy imports from Russia as fast as possible. That's correct, but there are different situations in different countries how fast that can go, because sanctions should be a punishment for the other side rather than bringing down our own industry. So we do that as fast as possible, but it cannot be done from one day to the other.
How worried are you that after now Putin decided to stop gas deliveries to Poland, Bulgaria is on shaky ground there, if Russia turns off gas supplies to Germany, what then?
Well, actually, we're preparing for that case, but we don't expect it to happen. We'll see what happens. The fact is that everybody knows that we have to get out of the dependency on Russian energy imports as fast as possible, and that's what our government is doing.
That was German parliamentarian Ralf Stegner from Chancellor Olaf Scholz governing Social Democrat Party. So how important are these deliveries of anti-aircraft weapons? Let's discuss them with Frank Ledwidge. He's a former military intelligence officer, now lectures in military capabilities and strategy at the University of Portsmouth in the UK. Frank, you've been following this war closely. What's your reaction to Germany's decision to supply heavy weapons, finally?
Very important decision. Concerning the weapons themselves, the Gepards, they're an old design, but they've been modernised. They've been out of service in the German army only for about 10 years, and many armies still use them. They're extremely formidable, short range, but if you're a pilot, there's nothing you can do about them if you get near. Same applies, by the way, to the British anti-aircraft vehicles they sent. But it's not only directly effective, but the possession of it keeps aircraft away as a deterrent. But what's significant, Gerhard, is that the most recent tranche of weapons deliveries from the West, not only NATO, the Swedes as well, are interesting for another reason. All of these now are NATO standard items. They're different from the Soviet stuff that East European nations have been passing on and will continue to. Now, there's also training implications in this, because you can't just hand over these Gepards and expect people to use them. They're radar-guided guns. They're quite complex. It will take a few weeks to train on that. So I would be fairly certain that there'll be a training package. But that's going to continue. So what we're seeing now is NATO standard equipment being sent institutionally, continually to the Ukrainians. And that does change things, I think, because it winds NATO even closer into the conflict.
Zooming out and to get a more general picture of that conflict, Russia claims it's making advances in several parts of eastern Ukraine. What are you seeing? Are Ukrainian forces losing their grip in the east there?
I don't think so. For the second time in a week, the Russians declared that they captured Crimea in the far east of the salient, where in the Donbass where fighting has taken place. Of course, what they don't announce are little villages and towns that the Ukrainians are nibbling back at in counterattacks. I think from the Russian perspective, it's quite a disappointing first week or 10 days of this particular campaign. They've been pressing all along that 500 or nearly 500 kilometre front. They've been looking for breakthroughs. That's what they do. That's what anyone would do. But they simply don't really have the mass to exploit any breakthrough if they were to make it. And the problem they face now is that they're getting into heavily fortified Ukrainian towns. Severodonetsk, they'll soon, well, if they succeed, they'll be getting towards Kramatorsk. Ukrainians know they've been coming. What the Ukrainians will do there is create other Mariupols. Fortified towns will take a lot of time and a lot of casualties, even to come close to reducing.
Now, the US Secretary of Defense said yesterday he thinks Ukraine can win this war. Do you agree?
As with everything else, Gerhard, what constitutes winning? From the Ukrainian perspective, of course, that would be expelling all the invading forces. What they certainly can do, I think at the moment, absent any significant escalation, is hold the Russians off. They may have to give some ground there in the east. Obviously, they've lost that corridor down to Crimea. The issue is over the next weeks, months, and yes, as Secretary Blinken hinted, possibly years, is whether the Ukrainians can gather enough force to retake the ground that they have lost. That's a very different matter. But what this is, as he said today, Blinken said today or yesterday, it's a long-term prospect now. We need to look at it strategically. So we'll see. The answer is on the battlefield and we don't know it yet.
Frank Ledwidge there, thank you very much.
DW Russia correspondent Emily Sherwin is here in the studio with me. Emily, huge discrepancies in the numbers of the fallen on the Russian sides, depending on who you ask, right? How is Russia handling the numbers coming out of this conflict?
Well, the Kremlin is tightly controlling these numbers. We've only had the Ministry of Defense in Russia publish numbers of fallen soldiers on the Russian side twice, the last time at the end of March, when they said just over 1,300 soldiers were killed. And an example for that tight control is, you might remember it, the sinking of the Moskva flagman, the ship, which was the flagman of the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. There was a lot of mystery around that. So initially Russia said that the crew was fully evacuated. There was, though, a wreath at the ceremony for the ship, which said to the crew and the ship, which journalists noted. And investigative journalists also did a lot of digging. They found posts from parents who were talking about their children being missing, and they put the number of dead right around 37 or 40 people. And only last week, there was an official statement saying that one crew member died and that 27 are missing. So it's unclear, even just on that example, whether that's the full picture. And it's also common for mothers or relatives of soldiers to be kind of silenced, put pressure on. And apparently, Russia is also using mobile crematoria in Ukraine, including for their own.
We heard in the report about 2 fallen soldiers, Russian side. What more do we know about the people fighting Putin's war?
We